And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection, your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. The BC Forest Act was amended in 1947 to establish forest management practices for long-term yield of timber. It was amended in 1979 to ensure that BC forests were logged in a manner which gave the best return to government and to society. On today's Open Connection, we rejoin the nation-to-nation conversation outlook for the forestry sector.
The opportunity is, let's get the wood to the right place. We need to find a mechanism where that fiber log gets paid for what it actually costs to deliver. So that's, I could go on forever, so I'll stop there.
Okay, and Troy, where do you think that opportunity lies? Not only just with that pulp fiber, but where do you think there's opportunity here in the forest sector? Because I've been in it for 41 years now, and I still believe in it. It will not look like what it did 10 or 15 years ago, but what do you think the opportunity is, and what does it look like going forward?
I think because we just went down to Victoria to meet with the chief forester and try and answer that exact question, and starting to see all the new innovations that are coming out. It's amazing what you could do with a fiber log nowadays, whereas before is just make paper and burn for energy. But the trying to attract industry up here to help us deal with that fiber log, that would be it'll put a lot of people back to work because we'll be able to afford to go logging again.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where we have to head. Dennis, what do you think about opportunity in the future? You guys log, like you said, upwards to 2 million, but 1.5 million, well, maybe down to 1.2 because of permitting. But where do you see that future opportunity being?
Sorry, got some stage fright. I forgot to mention when I introduced myself, I'm also an accountant. So I think there are more opportunities to work together. I mean, that Canfor made a decision, to park their investment into the Houston mill, which may or may not be a financial decision because the wood attached to that license there is fantastic. But they've got a problem where they're losing tens of millions of dollars every quarter, and they can't convince their board to spend that money right now, even though that is a good business. So I think there is more opportunity through the 10-year reform that's been happening slowly, and getting the access to the fiber into the hands of more people to come up with creative solutions. And I mean, maybe the price of lumber goes up this spring and Canfor makes that investment, and we all forget about this and everyone's happy forever after. But I think it's probably more likely that there's multiple owners in that space, and new partners with other forest companies that are more interested in being in BC. But the getting tenure away from the big three forest companies and into everybody else's hands is, I think, the biggest opportunity.
That's a great segue into what I wanted to talk to you guys about next, was how do you see that happening? Because I know that the Community Forest Board of British Columbia, Jen Gunther, and other individuals across the province, including Vanderhoof and other communities, have been asking for at least a 20% take back of the big wood, or the big industry wood, if not all, but 20% is a big ask. Why? Because it gives local governments, including Indigenous governments, that opportunity to have more hands on the land base. And so I wanted to know your thoughts about trying to get whatever volume it is back to local government and Indigenous governments, because the Indigenous governments are at the table. They're the ones that are co-governing, or should be governing, the land base with the province. So how do we get to that point where we're not working in the silos, but we're working together as communities? And that's a lot to unpack, but how do we get to that point? Because I think we're all saying the right thing provincially, there's a big ask to get that volume back out of big corporations. The problem is they've had 2 decades of successive governments creating the legislation that it's very difficult to get it back out from them. We'd think it'd be pretty easy to get it back for Terrace or Vanderhoof, but it's going to be very difficult. So thoughts on local government and Indigenous governments grabbing, and I'm going to say, grabbing that volume back.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. In forestry, a tenure is a formal agreement between government and a private entity, like a company, community, or individual, that grants the right to use and manage Crown or public forest land, and for resources over a specific period. This agreement outlines the condition in which the timber can be harvested, including responsibilities for forest management and the payment of fees. Let us rejoin the conversation with Rick.
There's a great opportunity because, depending on what government is in play after October 19th, but with DRIPA, UNDRIP, the implementation of it, that has to be solution driven, and that requires government to look at and partner with, like I say, 200 plus First Nations across the province. Great opportunity to talk about how do we find a solution that works for us as a nation, and each nation to say that, and that can involve things like saying we need to talk about tenure, volume, whatever that might be. So that creates an opportunity there, and government is going to be motivated, hopefully, to kind of deal with that in some fashion. So there's a great play, a lever or a wedge way to get into that conversation. But also is understanding the working through the process to say it's not just about getting tenure, it's about getting tenure with a plan, right? Because you can't just, if you gave any of the nations here in the Northwest all the tenure, we still would be challenged by the economics of the circumstance. We also have to be thinking about how it places and where it works. So there needs to be a plan that goes with that process, and identifying, tenure creates an opportunity, but it's not the only thing. And tenure, it won't be the isn't the silver bullet. It's a package, and that's the problem for forestry in BC. Is it's wildly complicated on so many issues, and everybody wants to find the silver bullet. And and we've lived this world for so long, particularly in the Northwest, where it's been so weirdly complicated. So that we just want to make sure everybody understands it's not one silver bullet. We need a full-on armory of opportunities to work with, and we need governments that are willing to listen. And I think we're seeing that. Our keynote talked about that sea change, and they're looking and changing, and governments are starting to think differently. No matter who's in power, they're not going to be thinking the same way they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So there is a great opportunity to wedge our way into that conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I think precedent's being set right now on the take back. In that Mayor Joan Atkinson out of Mackenzie and Sayke and McLeod Lake, the government bought Canfor quota at whatever it was, $60 a meter. I can't remember the exact number, and then gave that to Sayke and McLeod Lake, 460,000 cubic meters. So that to me is precedent setting that is going to start to happen. And if I'm any community out there, that's what you should be asking for. It's set. The government's done it once. We should all be going in and asking for that. So Troy, what do you think about local governments and Indigenous communities and working together and trying to go after this tenure?
Well, one of Chief Roberts' one of Don's visions was to go after the tenure, to get it back under local ownership, because as Bill said earlier, no matter what government's in power, we're still going to be here we're still going to be like, we have patience, and we're in it for the long haul. The benefits of the First Nations getting involved is when we make money, it's not going to go back east, it's not going to go down south, it's not going west, it's going to stay here, and it's going to benefit here, it's going to benefit the region. And that was one of the things that we want to see is bring certainty back to the region and get us moving again.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think obtaining that is a great first step. Investment dollars will be, this is where maybe our keynote speaker, where that comes into play, because there will need to be investment dollars to help with that. But so, Dennis, what are your thoughts from your company's point of view of that local government, Indigenous governments walking together, trying to make sure that tenure comes back locally?
Well, we are partnered with the Weewagkai First Nation in Campbell River. We started a company together 4 years ago called Waikiki Limited Partnership, and that was created because the nation had decided that they were going to acquire the forest licenses when Interforest shut down, and they wanted to create a logging company that would actually, employ and train community members. And since then, they did buy the Interfor license. It's a large cut down there. It's like 350,000 cubic meters. And then they partnered with Western and another band to create a company called the Quesamac that is administered by Western, but it's jointly managed by the two nations and Western, and they plan out in advance, how much wood's going to be harvested and where it's going to go, and it's worked quite well. There's no issues with permits down there. Everything's pretty organized because everybody's always talking and they're on the same page.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Earlier this year, Mercer Peace River Pulp and Woodland Cree First Nations signed a historic agreement extending their co-ownership relationship of Peace River logging. Since 2004, this joint venture has secured employment for more than 80 local people. Let us rejoin the conversation with Brian.
Tells us all that there are partnerships, more and more partnerships over the last probably decade between communities and organizations that are created to make things work. And I think that's a great path forward to ensure that we keep the industry moving forward. One of the things that we see changing a lot in the industry is technology, whether it's on the ground or even if it's old. The inventory data needs to be updated, and I could speak about inventory, and I think maybe we should go into that. And so I know that my fellow consultant will be able to talk a lot more about this, but in British Columbia, the inventory on the ground is, so government looks on a piece of paper and has a polygon on it and says that's a cedar type or that's a hemlock type, and they give some numbers to it based on some really extrapolated data. And it's a long story, but honest to goodness, the data is incorrect as a whole. So we're making decisions on the land base with poor data. So if we have poor data, we're making poor decisions. And it's something that we as an industry, we as local governments, Indigenous communities, governments have been saying for quite a while. So where do we see technology? And Rick, I'll get to you, and maybe it's, I don't know if it's drones or whatever, but where do we see technology helping us make better decisions with good data? And it doesn't have to be just on inventory, it can be wherever, but where do we see technology helping us move the industry forward?
Well, at the risk of just boring people to tears, because technology and inventory, and then foresters, we dive into all of our weird words and things like that. Anyway, but yeah, so one of the places where technology is certainly going to help us is on taking information and processing it quicker and better so we can do better planning, and also helping update that information so it's more real, and things like AI and imagery and computer analyses programs and things like that are all going to be very helpful with that. One of the things I do is I advise at a treaty level for a couple of First Nations, Kitsim-Kalim and Kitsilas in particular, and both nations in getting ready for treaty on the assumption that they will actually have, a ratified treaty in about 2 or so years, has already prepped an updated inventory for their treaty lands, because they know how important it is, and that's all using updated technology and whichever. And then we use drones to capture and do what's called LiDAR. We'll get into their fancy mapping, which allows us to better plan, be more efficient in how we plan, or how you can do things. So there's, like I say, the technology opportunities are there. The only cautionary note is we still have to get on the ground to confirm things. We still have to put our boots and get her on the ground and get our feet dirty and our hands dirty, because you can analyze forever, but sometimes you're still going to get surprised. And having people involved in that conversation is really important. So one of the things that's kind of related to technology is things we have to do is like update the land use planning processes and things like that. We do, in this area, the last time there was a formal kind of land use plan was done was 1996. So just like the inventory is out of date, the land use plan is. Things like pipelines weren't even thought of at that point. So we've had all these changes that have happened. So yes, we can use technology, but we also need to use people and brains and talk to each other, work together as a community, and kind of cross the silos and bring communities and nations and governments all to the table to have the conversation. So broad spectrum, but yes, technology is a real great tool. We still need the people at the back end working it.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Last year, Kitsim-Kalim Economic Development Group purchased Skeena Sawmills, the Skeena Bioenergy Pellet Plant, and all relevant assets in a complex sales agreement with a cash purchase price of $14.05 million. In this final segment of Open Connection, Troy gives us an update on Skeena Sawmills.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Troy, what do you think about technology and where we're headed? How's it going to help us? Is it hindering us? You'd mentioned earlier about maybe the technology finding more to do with the wood and what you can do with it. Is it going to help, or do we need more boots on the ground, or is it a combination?
It's going to be a combination. After purchasing Skeena Sawmills with all the tenures that along what came with that was the waste and residue that is left over, and so definitely being able to use drones to assess, and we could make more efficient plans to go measure that waste and residue, and using getting back to using the local First Nations. They're the ones that know the tenure. They're the ones that know the forest. They've been there for thousands and thousands of years. So continuing working with the local First Nations to future management.
That's good. And Dennis, what are your thoughts from a on the ground logging show? How does technology help or hinder you?
Well, in the northeast of the Prince George TSA, logging basically stopped for a couple years because it's caribou habitat and it's important that it's preserved. And it was a pretty big deal for the licensees, especially the Sinclair Group. We have the replaceable contract at their Lakeland mill, so their license is greatly affected. So we've actually worked with the Sinclair Group to figure out a long-term strategy to harvest selectively using steep slope equipment that you would not normally find in the interior of BC. And it is a little more expensive, but if you time it right and you're working together, you can keep the delivered log cost low enough that the mill can still be profitable. So
we spent probably the first half of this talking, and we're not going out logging every valley, and we're not logging every, because I think one has probably been done to a point, but there has to be some look at where we are in conservation and using the resource. And so I'm going to ask you each about your thoughts on conservation, what the process looks like. There are way more values than timber, and I've told people in this audience, I was, and I affectionately call myself a timber pig. That's what I did for 41 years. Is I laid out wood in Vanderhoof and Fort St. James, and I didn't know any better, but I laid out wood without really much consideration of a lot of the other values out there. So, Rick's right. Last process we did in Vanderhoof was the Vanderhoof LRMP. And so we thought that was it. And we set all of these values up. And in that LRMP land use plan, and we set aside the NT-ACO for caribou, and we set aside the finger haddock for grizzly bear habitat. And then the Kenny Dam area was archaeological stuff, and Francois Lake was set aside for visual. And then you jump ahead 24 years, and Mother Nature's come along with climate change, and has been a changing climate for longer than that, but has burnt every one of those. So, as people of Terrace, or the Northeast, the Northwest, the Central Interior, how do we get to a point where there is some conservation of values that really need to be preserved or looked at, and not just set aside? Because set aside, Mother Nature in our neck of the woods, Mother Nature's going to come along and burn it, because that's what she's done. And that's just an example for us. So I'm looking for the answer of, and it's not the answer today, but your thoughts on how do we get conservation and removing an opportunity on the land base. And that may mean it looks like there's more management on the land base.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.